Greetings, comrades. Let's start with a quick review of the key concepts relating to this AOS. So you might want to freeze the screen so you can do a quick audit of these concepts and therefore reflect on strengths and weaknesses, things to target in the lead up to the exam. Now, key skills in terms of the nervous system is being mindful of the dichotomy between the parallel levels of the nervous system. So for instance, when you're talking about the functionality of the peripheral nervous system, are you doing it in a way that shows that you are clear on the difference between its role and the central nervous system's role? So for instance, if you are talking about sensory input, the peripheral nervous system detects sensory input, light, sound, tactile information, and then it's conveyed to the central nervous system where it is processed. So key thing, you don't say that the peripheral nervous system processes sensory input. That's the central nervous system's job. As reflected by these other pinky comments, be mindful of your terminology when you are describing the major divisions of the NS and also the subdivisions. Now, when talking about the sequence of activity in terms of a conscious response to sensory stimuli, don't forget that it all starts with the sensory component. So we have sensory neurons, sensory receptors that detect tactile information, for instance. Sensory neurons convey those afferent signals to the brain. The brain will process it. The brain will initiate a response voluntarily, and then an efferent signal will reach a skeletal muscle that's regulated by the somatic nervous system that will trigger the response. Now, similar process for an unconscious response. It starts and ends with the somatic nervous system in terms of the detection of the sensory input and the execution of the motor response. But in the middle, what we do is we discuss the role of the interneurons in the spinal cord that integrate that sensory and motor signals and therefore triggers that response independently of the brain. That is a protective and adaptive response that's quicker than if it had to go, if that signal had to go all the way to the brain and back, because we're reducing tissue damage and therefore enhancing our survival. Now, check out this question which stumped students. Someone pricks their finger and immediately withdraws it. This response demonstrates, you might want to freeze the screen so you can process the options here, but only 17% of the state correctly identified A. So let's unpack this question. A lot of people went for B, and the problem with B is this word here, making decisions. So yes, the spinal cord's involved, but making a decision is a conscious process, so that's incongruent. So the adaptive nature of the human nervous system explains the functionality of the reflex response. So the point there is read carefully all the options so that you can eliminate the distractors, particularly when we have incongruence in terms of the response and the question. Here's another nervous system question. So we've got Vicky, she's woken up to something scratching at the bedroom and becomes so frightened that she cannot move. Vicky is experiencing which of the following? So again, freeze if you want to process these questions. Let's go through it. So check out the stats here. The state was really split on this between A, B and D. Let's unpack the answer, which is A. So the inability to move is due to the parasympathetic nervous system dominance. So when we experience a freeze response, the sympathetic nervous system hasn't been kicked in yet, hasn't been activated. So therefore, if it was, we would move. So the problem with B is the incongruence. We've got a heightened heart rate, sympathetic nervous system is active, and yet we can't move. That's the incongruence that I'm talking about. So again, process of elimination will lead you to A, because we are experiencing a freeze response. Now, be mindful that in terms of the 4 neurochemicals that feature in this AOS, the 2 neuromodulators that we need to know, dopamine and serotonin, they're actually a subclass of neurotransmitters. There's some common ground with neurotransmitters and neuromodulators, particularly the fact that they're released from a presynaptic axon terminal. But some points of difference let's have a look at the following slide. So GABA and glutamate are released from an axon terminal, and they just target the adjacent cell in the one-to-one exchange, whereas serotonin and dopamine, well, they're released into a large area of brain tissue, and they target tens of thousands of cells. GABA and glutamate, they have a rapid effect on the adjacent postsynaptic cell, whereas dopamine and serotonin can have a more lingering effect on those postsynaptic cells in that large area of tissue. Now, this slide is text heavy, so let me verbally go through points of emphasis. In terms of the scope of the course, just be mindful, dopamine can be either inhibitory or excitatory as a neurotransmitter, but we're focusing on its role as a neuromodulator in terms of reinforcing desirable activity, particularly in terms of eating and drinking. So when we're hungry or thirsty and we start that drinking action, and so therefore the reward pathways of the brain are literally processing the fact that this is satisfying my hunger, chewing up the food, or this is satisfying my thirst by gulping down the drink. And so therefore the modulation occurs in these cells by literally attaching the behavior with the reward. And so therefore the brain will recognize in these reward pathways that the next time we're thirsty, we need to gulp down a liquid. Next time we're hungry, we need to munch on some food. So it's actually rewarding the behavior that satisfies those cravings. Now, let's touch on the role of serotonin as a neuromodulator. We know it plays a key role in mood, but it also plays a key role in the areas of the brain responsible for our impulse control. So, for instance, if we're in a social context and someone is inappropriate and we have a hostile thought, it's the serotonin that modulates the parts of our brain that will respond to that inappropriateness by keeping ourselves in check. So if we have a healthy level of serotonin as a neuromodulator, then we'll be able to read the situation and be measured in our response. If there's a lack of it, then we might respond with aggression and hostility that might come back and haunt us a bit later. Now, if you get a question that says in terms of synaptic plasticity, that brings in a whole bunch of options within the scope of the course. The obvious ones will be LTP and LTD, or maybe we're getting more precise at a neural level and we're talking about sprouting, pruning, rerouting, etc. Now, 2 points of emphasis for both LTP and LTD. For both of them, repetition, and secondly, there's a change in the strength of the neural pathways responsible for a memory or a behavior. So in terms of LTP, as a result of repeatedly revisiting a memory, that is going to repeatedly activate the neural pathway responsible for that. And it's that high level activation with high intensity, high frequency that's going to strengthen that pathway. Now, students historically in terms of LTD, they oversimplify it. They just say that the cells have been pruned. And whilst that's partly correct, it doesn't fully explain LTD, because LTD also occurs as a result of repeated activation, but the activation is at a low level. So therefore, the input from the presynaptic cell is so weak that the postsynaptic cell doesn't hit an action potential threshold, it doesn't fire. So as a result of that repeated activation, low-level activation of the cell, and we're not getting a firing of the postsynaptic cells, the pathways are weakening over time, which is a good thing because it enhances the LTP process to enable our brain to modify for new learning, modified learning. Now, as a result of the LTP process, we can get some sprouting at both ends of the synapse, dendritic spines on the postsynaptic end, and some axon terminals at the presynaptic end. In terms of LTD, well, we might have, like I talked about before, some pruning of the connections, the cells which is a good thing because it frees up our finite neural resources to enable LTP to occur more efficiently. Then we get into stress. Now, importantly, in terms of the study design terminology, it's a psychobiological process. So psychologically, we're experiencing all those stress indicators of anxiety, etc., or it could be a good thing like excitement. And as a result of that, whether it be good or bad, there's going to be some physiological changes, increases in heart rate, respiration, levels of adrenaline, and suppression of other activity, which we'll get to. And this stress can be triggered internally, psychologically, and biologically. So this is just a bit of classification, or externally outside of the body in an environmental or social context. Now, students tend to be pretty good at talking about chronic stress, but let's not forget acute stress. Acute stress is short term. We tend to resolve it pretty quickly, and that's when we get that triple F activation. And generally, when we respond to an acute stressor, we have an adaptive response where we either fight, flight, or freeze. Now, as I mentioned a few slides back with that MC question, if we're fighting or flighting a stressor, then the sympathetic nervous system is very much the dominant division of our autonomic nervous system, so we get that rapid increase in arousal to maximize our survival prospects. But when we're in freeze mode, the parasympathetic nervous system is still the dominant division of our autonomic nervous system. The body's acting as if it's injured, and the brain just hasn't figured out how to best fight or flight the stressor. So generally, when we freeze, it's brief, and then we'll flip the switch, and then we'll fight or flight so we can basically survive this threatening situation. Now, historically, students are pretty good at explaining why cortisol levels are detrimental if we have high levels that are sustained in the bloodstream. Students tend to struggle in explaining how cortisol helps, particularly during the middle part of dealing with a chronic stressor. So points of emphasis here is that high levels of cortisol in the bloodstream gives us energy. How? By enhancing the secretion of glucose from our liver. What does glucose do? It not only gives the body more energy, but also the brain. The brain absorbs a lot of this glucose so that we can maintain attention, we can make decisions, etc. Very useful for you stressed out Year 12 students so that we can get through the next few weeks with the energy we need to deal with the multiple exams on your plate. And so when you're explaining the detrimental effects of high levels of cortisol in the bloodstream, emphasis is on the fact that it suppresses the immune system, which in turn makes us more susceptible to minor illness initially, and then later on more major illness, which we'll get to when we talk about exhaustion with the gas. Now, with the GBA, you always start with emphasis on the fact that it's a bidirectional link between the gut and the brain. The brain can affect the gut can affect the brain. The key components are listed here. We'll go through these briefly. So the enteric nervous system literally lines the gastrointestinal tract, which plays a key role in digestion. It connects the central nervous system, the brain, along with the other divisions of the autonomic nervous system, and it regulates and modulates activity in our immune system and our endocrine systems, which release key hormones. Now, the vagus nerve largely deals with afferent signals, but also some efferent signals. It plays a key role in that gut to brain, brain to gut communication, and in turn with the enteric nervous system plays a key role in our immune response, the facilitation of digestion, and regulates our heart rate both in response to stress and after. Now, key points of emphasis about microbiota, it's mainly bacteria, gut bugs, and if we have a diet that's rich in pre and probiotics, then we have good diversity in terms of the good bacteria in our gut and reduced levels of bad bacteria. And the microbiota plays a key role in regulating our immune system, which is important when we're exposed to some bad bacteria. But it also plays a key role in the production of key neurochemicals that regulate our whole being and our cognition. And that's your go-to when you're asked, how does the gut affect the brain? Well, importantly, again, when we have good diversity in terms of our microbiota in our gut, based on a diet rich in pre and probiotics, is we're going to generate or produce adequate levels of these key neurochemicals that regulate our whole being and our cognition, our learning, etc. In terms of how the brain influences the gut, well, if we're chronically stressed and there's high levels of cortisol in our bloodstream, that can compromise our gut microbiota. And as a consequence of that, we have an impaired immune response, which increases our vulnerability to illness. We're less resilient to stressors, and we can develop a stress-related illness. Now, in terms of the GAS, be mindful of the terminology here, the explanatory power. That means we need to be able to evaluate it, both strengths and weaknesses, in relation to a given scenario. Now, be mindful that this model was devised by Selye because everyone knew that stress causes illness, but we had no evidence. It was all anecdotal. And so what Selye did was, under lab conditions, he exposed these lab rats, to a series of acute stressors to see how their immune system would adapt to these stressors over time. And based on their response, he built this model, the general adaptation syndrome, which means this is how a variety of species adapt to chronic stress over time in terms of their resistance and their immune response. Now, when you're talking about the alarm reaction stage, always start with emphasis on the fact that initially we go into shock and the resistance is lowered. The body's acting as if it's injured. The sympathetic nervous system is still dominant until we reach a point where the brain's ready to respond. And that's when we go into counter shock, and therefore the sympathetic nervous system becomes dominant. And so therefore we get a rush of adrenaline, which increases our arousal, and we get this spike in our resistance. Towards the end of that, cortisol will start to be released in the second wave of the stress response. Now, if we can't resolve the stressor during that counter shock phase, then the body goes into resistance. The sympathetic nervous system is still dominant, but the parasympathetic nervous system literally puts the brakes on so that we can sustain a high level of resistance to the stressor, as reflected by the graph here, where we're still well above our normal level of resistance here, but it's sustainable. And so how do we do this? Through cortisol. And so that cortisol, like I said before, is giving us the energy to sustain that high level of arousal required to deal with this stressor. But we might show some early signs of illness. But despite that, we can still function. So even though we've got a headache, a cold, sore throat, etc., we can still turn up to our English exam next week. We can still rock up to a party. We can still turn up to a shift, but we're just not feeling great. So there's still that functionality there. Now, if we can't resolve it during the back end of that resistance stage, that's when we hit exhaustion. Why? Because the immune system's shot. Because, again, one of the byproducts of cortisol is it suppresses immune system activity. And so therefore, the thing that you really need to emphasize is our resistance to the stressor is lowered, particularly if we're exposed to another stressor. And so because we've kind of been tipped over the edge, that makes us highly susceptible to developing a major illness, because there's just nothing left in our immune response tank. All right, check out this sneaky question from VCAR last year. According to the GAS, person is most likely enter the stage of exhaustion when? So freeze the screen and read through the responses. Let's go through it and check out the stats. Students are really split on this one in terms of B and C, and there were quite a few that went for A and D. So our answer is B. We experience chronic stress and then encounter acute stressor. And so that's the key point with exhaustion. We've been dealing with this initial stressor for a while where we're basically maintaining a high level of resistance, and then another stressor comes along, and that's what tips us over the edge and makes us ill. So A and C refer to the T model. Appraising, well, we know that's part of the transactional, and the perception of having the resources to cope, that's part of our secondary appraisal. So we can eliminate that one. Explanatory power of the model. So again, strengths and weaknesses are what you need to be emphasizing when asked about the explanatory power. So in terms of this model compared to the transactional model, it highlights the physiological processes that are involved in terms of cortisol and the immune system when we're responding to a chronic stressor. It shows us the relationship empirical based on that testing of the rats between chronic stress and illness. But it doesn't account for individual differences. It's not called the general adaptation syndrome for nothing, thinking about what we mean by general. Now, in terms of the transactional model, the reason why it's called transactional is because there's an exchange. On one side of the transaction, there are the stressful demands placed on a person. And this comes into play when we talk about the evaluation of the significance. And then on the other side of the transaction is the appraisal of your coping resources. And so therefore, this is a psychological model because of the cognitive aspects involved in that evaluation of significance and evaluation of the coping resources. So in terms of the primary appraisal, just remember an appraisal is an evaluation. What are we evaluating? Well, we're evaluating if the stressor is irrelevant, benign, or if it's significant. And if it is significant, then we determine whether it's harmful based on things that have already happened, threats to our future, or challenges which will require a sustained level of energy over a long period in order to respond to this stressor. Now, importantly, we're only going to make a secondary appraisal if we have appraised it as significant. There's no need to make a secondary appraisal if it's benign or irrelevant. But if we are appraising the threats, harm, or challenges, then we evaluate our coping resources. And this is going to trigger either avoidant or an approach coping strategy or context-specific effectiveness, because we can tie these together. So for this sample question from the 2017 exam, we've got two guys exposed to the same stressor. They just want to make the under 21 footy team. Alex, he's not sleeping. He's worried that he won't make the team, won't go to sleep. Danny, he loves his footy. He's pleased with his development, etc. So the question asks, explain why they've evaluated this situation different in terms of the primary appraisal. So therefore, what we need to do is we need to explain, well, Alex, it's significant. There's harm because he's not sleeping. Danny, it's benign. He's not worried about it. So therefore, he doesn't need to make a secondary appraisal because he's just taking it in his stride. Now, that got you 2 out of 3 for differentiating between those two. A lot of students missed the 3rd mark, even though it's on the sample exam. It relates to a question from a previous exam, because they didn't explain the subjective process of this model. Again, the explanatory power deems that you and I can be exposed to the same stressor, but we can have a very different evaluation, which is what we have with Alex and Danny. So that was either the starting or ending point of the response, that we needed to emphasize that stress is subjective based on this model. And so therefore that basically explains why we can basically come up with a very different evaluation of significance. So in terms of the explanatory power of the T model, this model very nicely caters for individual differences as reflected by that previous question I just went through. In terms of the limitation, unlike GAS, doesn't cater for the physiological variations in our response to a stressor that the GAS outlines. So I know this is a bit small on your screen, but we've got a scenario here where we're measuring heart rate during a night's sleep. We've got nightmare here, and we've got a control phase here. And the question's asking to evaluate the explanatory power of the T model in terms of the increase in heart rate. So 1 mark if you said that this model has poor explanatory power for explaining an increase in heart rate. 2nd mark for the justification, because it's a psychological model, not a biological model, which is what we have with the GAS. So again, be mindful about the terminology here in terms of the explanatory power. It's mentioned 3 times in the study design: for the GAS, for the transactional model, and for the multi-stall model in the next area study. Now, in terms of context-specific effectiveness, what we need to use is our mental thesaurus when we are explaining whether we have context-specific effectiveness. And the key point is, and VCAR assessors love this, it's always in the sample solution guides, that we want to determine if the coping strategy that we've employed, which would be an approach strategy, is a good fit for dealing with the unique demands of that stressor. And that's going to be influenced by our personal characteristics in terms of the way we respond to stressors. So key point, when you're asked to determine whether context specificness, effectiveness has been employed, or to evaluate it, you're going to either mention that the strategy is a good fit if it's an approach strategy, and if it's an avoidance strategy, you're probably going to say it's not a good fit. So don't be scared to basically make that claim that the coping strategy employed of drinking or venting or whatever is not a good fit, so therefore it is not context-specific effectiveness. Now, when we're using an avoidance strategy to cope with the stressor, we're directing our energy away from the stressor. That might be a good thing in the short term because we're conserving energy. It enables us to focus on other aspects of our life, and it gives us a bit of a mental timeout to ponder how we are going to approach the stressor later on. But if we always take an avoidance strategy, it's maladaptive because we're running away from our problems, and potentially we might ruminate more about how to deal with this or not deal with it. If we're using an approach strategy, that's when we're directing our energy to the source of the stressor and how to resolve it. This comes at a cost, and this is the negative of using an approach strategy. It will consume a lot of energy. We might neglect other facets of our life. But ultimately, it is a more adaptive strategy. Final slide. The state was really split on this one between options B and C as reflected by the stats. Now the problem with B is this word here. It's an absolute statement. It is always maladaptive. Well, an avoidance strategy is not always maladaptive in the short term because, like I said before, it gives us a chance to conserve energy. It gives us a chance to ponder how we might approach it when we're ready a bit later on after we get some advice, after we sleep on it. But an avoidance strategy will reduce stress in the short term. So therefore, this is our best option.